So picking up where that last video cut off, just doing a quick review of those individual parts and how they are put together to build out that muscle as a whole. Um, the reason that the bundling is so important is because the individual strands by themselves would not be able to work very efficiently. And there is strength in numbers. So while the individual parts are very important, being able to pull them together and have them working together as one unit is going to be very important. Your muscle movements would be very different if this bundling process didn't happen. You would not have nice fluid movements. You would be jerky, much more robotic in how you were able to move. So again, those individual pieces being brought together and bundled in those layers to ultimately create the muscle as a whole is vital to movement as we know it. So the one thing that we didn't talk about was the muscle coverings, and there's actually three of them that you have over the muscle. You have the endomysium, the perimysium, and the epimysium. So those three prefixes are very important because they tell you where in the positioning that the three layers are found. So the endo is going to be the innermost layer, the peri is going to be in between the other two, and the epi is always going to be the outermost layer. So go back to other things that we've talked about, the epidermis, that is the outermost layer of skin. So we use that epi prefix to indicate the outer layer. Now, in the particular structure that you have in that picture, it shows you the muscle and it shows the endomysium. That endomysium is going to ultimately be located around the muscle fibers. So that particular muscle covering is going to take the individual, those myofibrils, wrap around those and create or build out your muscle cells or your muscle fibers. The perimysium is going to be found around the fascicles, and then the epimysium is actually going to bundle all of the fascicles together and then wrap around the muscle as a whole. The fascia does the same thing. It's an extra layer of protection that we have with the fascia. So the epimysium bundles the muscle as a whole together. The fascia does the same thing, but the fascia is found on top of that epimysium. So the next slide that you have talks about the parts of the muscle. And when you look at this particular slide, essentially what we're going through is we're going through the organelles of the muscle, which we've gone through the organelles of a typical body cell. And so some of this is going to be review. You've heard it before. Some of them are going to be brand new because they have structures that we don't see in other body cells. Your somatic cells don't need them. So there are some unique structures that we have here within the muscle cell. So if you look at the first one on the list, it talks about the sarcolemma, and the sarcolemma is the equivalent to the cell membrane. So if you think about what the cell membrane does for the body cell, it does the same thing for your muscle cell. Then you have the sarcoplasm. The sarcoplasm is the equivalent of cytoplasm. So in a somatic cell, the cytoplasm is going to fill all of that extra space, not taken up by organelles or other materials in the cell, kind of like the air in the room takes up space not used by people or other structures in the room. Sarcoplasma does the same thing within your muscle cell. Then we get into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, abbreviated as SR, which should sound very similar to your endoplasmic reticulum. It's the muscle equivalent of the endoplasmic reticulum. Now, when I introduced it with the body cell, I told you guys to think about it as being hallways. So when you guys are maneuvering through a building, the hallways are going to channel you from one location to another. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum does the same thing in a cell. It's a series of membranes, but what it does is it takes cell products, it channels them through the cell to get them to the location that they need to be. Now, with the sarcoplasmic reticulum, we have a special structure that we didn't see or talk about before, and those are the cisternae. The cisternae are going to basically be holding tanks for your calcium ions. Now, the thing about calcium is if I asked you guys to make an association between calcium and a body part, most people are not going muscles, they're going bones. And that is where we think of our calcium being. You hear about it on commercials all the time, taking calcium for your bone health. Calcium is huge in our bone structure and our bone strength. But what people don't always realize is that the reason we use our bones to store calcium, yes, so that they are strong structures in for themselves, but they're actually working as a reserve of calcium because your muscle contractions cannot happen without calcium. And if you don't put enough calcium in your body on a daily basis through the foods that you eat, your body has to be able to go somewhere and get that calcium, because as soon as you run out of calcium, your muscles can't contract. And that would include the heart, which obviously is a huge problem. So to make sure that that doesn't happen, and diets can be unpredictable. People don't like certain foods. And so, like I said, if they're not getting that calcium in through their diet, they have to get it somewhere else. We have hormones in the body, which if your blood calcium levels start to drop too low, hormone will be dumped into your bloodstream, circulates to your bones, and it will actually dissolve your bone tissue. When that bone tissue is dissolved, it releases calcium. That calcium goes into your bloodstream. Now your blood will carry it to your muscles. Your muscle has the calcium ions that it needs to make sure that those muscle contractions can continue to happen. It works in the reverse as well. If you have an overabundance of calcium, your body will not flush that. What will actually happen is you have a different hormone that's released into your system, and it will take all of that extra calcium that you don't need, and it will build it into your bones. And so you can put it back in if you've had to strip it. The problem is most of the time people are deficient in their calcium. And so on a regular basis, their body is having to steal that calcium out of your bones. Now, when that happens over a period of 10, 20, 30 years, what actually happens is that calcium keeps getting stripped out, stripped out, stripped out time and time again. And the bones will become weak, and they'll actually start to get tiny little fractures in them. And as that happens over time, the fractures, they're not large enough that you feel them, but you go to the doctor's office, and what's one of the first things they do? They weigh and they measure you. They are looking to see if your height is decreasing, because that can tell them a lot about your bone health. If those fractures are happening, they typically happen in our weight-bearing bones, the bones of your vertebrae and the bones of your hips. So over time, those fractures happen, your vertebrae will start to settle on top of each other. And that is why we associate older people as shrinking, because those bones are fracturing, tiny, tiny little fractures. But when it happens over a period of time, they start to build up, and those bones will start to settle on top of each other. So you have the calcium in your bones as a reserve and as a backup, but too many times people use it too often, and they're not in overabundance enough where it's getting replaced back into their bones. Those bones get the fractures. That is what we call osteoporosis. Like I said, it happens in your weight-bearing bones more often than not. And we also associate older people with breaking their hips. So they fall and they break their hips. They are finding more and more that oftentimes what happens is they are simply standing. They go from a seated position to standing upright. And because of all those fractures they have throughout their hip bones, the sheer weight of their own body causes the bone to break. And that's actually what causes the fall. So, like I said, looking at calcium ions, we think about it being in your bones. Your bones actually keep it to make sure that you always have enough on hand for your muscles so that those muscle contractions never stop happening. The cisternae are going to be the structures within your muscles that hold those calcium ions, because you don't want them to be released and floating through the cell, because it would cause a muscle contraction to happen. So you'd be having muscle contractions when you didn't want them. So the cisternae hold them, and it will wait for a nerve impulse. When the nerve impulse comes in, tells the cisternae to release those calcium ions. Now the calcium ions are going to be spread throughout the muscle, and we'll talk about the process of how that actually then turns into a muscle contraction. That will be next time. So cisternae are very important part of this sarcoplasmic reticulum to hold those calcium ions, make sure that they are on hand for whenever you need that muscle to contract. Now the transverse tubule runs in between the cisternae, if you look at that picture. And this picture doesn't do it justice. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to move things through the muscle cell, but it more does it on the surface layer. And if you look at how this is all bundled together, you can see that you have an inner core to that muscle that the calcium would need to get to, that other materials would need to get to. And so the transverse tubules are going to dive down into the muscle and get to those inner core structures as well. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum more to the surface, and then the transverse tubules are going to make sure that they get down into those inner structures and they get all the same materials delivered to them as well. When you go to the triad, that prefix tri tells you 3, and you have the 2 cisternae, a right and a left, and then sandwiched in between you have that transverse tubule. When you put those 3 structures together, that is your triad. The myofibril, we already talked about this briefly. When you get a series of sarcomeres bundled together or linked together in a chain-like fashion, that is going to create a myofibril. So it is a chain of sarcomeres all linked together. That makes the myofibril. Actin and myosin, we haven't really talked about specifically. Earlier on, I told you the light and dark bands that make up our striations. And what actually creates those light and dark bands are these 2 structures of actin and myosin. They're both proteins, and the actin is a thin protein. The myosin is a thick protein. Because of the thickness difference, actin being thin actually appears to be very light in color. Myosin being thick appears very dark in color. So when you put the actin and the myosin next to each other in a muscle, you get a light band and then a dark band. And they alternate back and forth with each other. And so that creates that striated appearance. And we will talk more about that when we get into the muscle and contraction, because that's also the organization of the muscle for that contraction to be able to happen. And then the last one on there is the sarcomere. The sarcomere is a contractile unit. In pretty much every branch of science, you have the smallest structure. In chemistry, it's the atom. In biology, it's the cell. And when we look at a muscle, the smallest functioning unit you have is the sarcomere. Now, with a sarcomere, it's a contractile unit, and it is only going to shrink down in size. When we talk about a muscle relaxing, it simply slides back to its original length, but it doesn't actually extend out and become any longer. When we talk about the sarcomere structure, I don't know if anybody's ever taken apart a click pen, but inside of a click pen you have a spring. And usually if you give somebody a spring, the first thing they'll do is they'll squish it down so it's as small as it possibly can be. That's how a sarcomere works. So it has its original length, you push it and cram it all together, it gets shorter in length, and when each sarcomere contracts and gets shorter in length, and it happens as a domino effect, and the whole muscle shortens up, that's a muscle contraction. And because those individual sarcomeres slide together and get shorter, that's why you get a bulge in a muscle when it contracts, is because you had all these sarcomeres that relaxed are a certain length, but when they contract, they all bunch together and you get that excess, which creates the muscle bulge. Now, with the sarcomere, when it relaxes, and that's kind of a deceiving word because sometimes when we think of relaxing, if you have that spring that you took out of the pen and you let it go, it goes back to its original length, but it's not going to stretch out to the point that it straightens out completely. It's still going to have its coil sliding back out to its original length, and that's all the further that it's going to go. And so it's the same thing with the sarcomere. It can contract and get shorter, but it will only go back to its original length. It does not get longer. And that's, like I said, deceiving a lot of times when you talk about or hear about muscles. Terms are used that would make it seem like it's getting longer, and it actually doesn't. So then you have the muscle contractions, and it gets into the myofilaments and the nerves. I want to wait until we are face to face for that particular conversation, just because I think being able to back that up with some other information and showing you that as we move through it is important. So I want to hold off on that. So jump all the way down to the slide that talks about characteristics of muscle tissues. And this is actually a chart. You have one in your textbook as well, but it talks about some of the different characteristics or features that are associated with the different muscle types. You have your skeletal, you have your smooth, and you have your cardiac. When it talks about the length and diameter, I'm not really worried about those. We're talking about micrometers here, which is a measurement that is so small, your brain can't even wrap around how small that actually is. So there's no sense having you memorize that. Um, you look at it, you can tell which one is the biggest, which one is the smallest, but to actually have a vision of what a micrometer is, um, that's beyond what we need to do. So major location, you guys are responsible for knowing that, where you would find your skeletal muscles attached to bones. The only place that you're going to find the cardiac muscle is in the heart. And then the smooth muscle is going to be found in your internal organs, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and things of that structure. Major function, we did talk about that. Your skeletal muscle is going to be attached to your bones to help carry out movement. Your smooth muscle, because of where it's found, helps in your blood vessels when it contracts. It helps move blood forward. In your intestinal tract, obviously moving food forward. In your stomach, when it contracts, it helps with the digestion process. So some of those internal structures or internal processes that happen within your body. And then the last one, just making sure that your blood is moving forward. That is going to be the major thing that your cardiac muscle is going to help with. The cell characteristics, striations, we talked about those, understanding that you do have striations in your skeletal muscle as well as your cardiac, but because of the organization in your smooth muscle and how the actin and the myosin are arranged, you are not going to see that within your smooth muscle. The nucleus, I'm not so worried that you know about where the nucleus is, other than within your skeletal muscle, that nucleus is pushed out to the sides. So you'll see it along the cell membranes of the muscle cells, but you're not going to see it in that center core like you would with most of your cells. And then the muscle or the mode of control, talking about your skeletal muscle being the only one that you have control over. The other two are going to be picked up or coordinated by your brain so that you don't have to worry about them. On the special features, make sure that with your cardiac muscle, we talked about the intercalated discs. That is the only place and the only muscle type that you see that particular structure because of how that special contraction of the heart needs to take place. So make sure that you are aware of that with your cardiac muscle. So that whole chart, we went through some of that information, but like I said, the measurements and things like that, I'm not worried about you guys having that in place. The muscle actions, you can skip over that one for right now and go to origin and insertion. This is tied into your movements. When we talk about muscles, muscles can only move in one direction. They only pull. And so when those sarcomeres contract and get shorter, they pull, and they are going to ultimately be what carries out the muscle movement that you have. So your muscle has two parts. One end is going to be the muscle origin, and one is going to be the muscle insertion. And technically, when you look at those two terms, origin is defined as being the immovable end of the muscle, and the insertion is going to be the movable end. What that means is, in order to carry out a movement, where a muscle starts and where a muscle ends, it has to be on opposite sides of a joint. That's key. So if it's going to be a muscle that carries out a movement that you can see in the body, one side of the muscle has to start on one side of a joint, and then the other side of the muscle has to end on the opposite side of that joint. So when we talk about your bicep actually starts on your humerus. That would be the origin. The insertion of your bicep muscle has two parts, hence the term bicep, bi indicating two. One head of the muscle or one part of the muscle is going to insert on the ulna. The other one is going to insert on the radius. Well, it crosses over what joint? Your elbow joint. So we know that that's a muscle that's going to carry out movement because where it starts and where it finishes is on opposing sides of that elbow joint. Now, when the muscle contracts, if you contract your bicep muscle, what part of your arm moves? It's the part elbow and below. So it's where the muscle inserted on those two bones. That is the area of the body that moves. Humerus side doesn't go anywhere. And that's why we refer to that as being the immovable end. You have that bicep muscle up here, but the humerus does not go anywhere. It's those lower bones. Same thing if you look at your hamstring. Hamstring originates on the femur, inserts or ends on the tibia and the fibula. So have we crossed over a joint? Yes, you have that knee joint where the muscle starts is on one side, where it ends is on the opposite side of that joint. So now when that hamstring contracts, top half of your leg, femur side, doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't move. It's that lower half of your leg that's actually going to carry out the movement. And then the last slide that you have, muscles working together. With the muscles working together, you don't have any action in your body that is carried out. There are a few exceptions, but a majority of your muscle actions are going to be a variety of muscles working together to carry out the action. You have the main muscle that's going to carry out the action, and that is your prime mover. So you have I just used your hamstrings as an example a second ago. So that's going to be your prime mover. That is the main muscle that is carrying out most of the movement. But because that muscle is usually very large in size, being able to get fine movements is not going to happen. And so you have these other muscles that are going to come in and play a role to help stabilize and regulate that movement so that you can get that finer motor control that you need to have to be more precise in your movements. So if you think about a simple task, if your pen or pencil is laying on the desk and you go to pick it up, if you were relying just on a prime mover to pick up that pen or pencil, you would probably have to try it 3 or 4 times before you would be able to pinpoint the exact location. Because by itself, that prime mover is going to be somewhat uncoordinated and you would hit and miss a few times before you actually grabbed onto where that pencil was located. So you are going to use things like synergists. Synergists are going to assist that prime mover. They are smaller muscles, and so they give you finer motor movement than what you would have with the prime mover by itself. Now, if you think about it, think back to when you were in kindergarten and what your papers look like. You wrote your name on your paper, and they give you these big old wide spaces and the dotted line in the middle to write your name. And most kids couldn't stay inside the lines. They would go way above the line, the huge letters. If you had a letter like an O that you could come around and close that O and make a nice round circle, didn't happen. And the reason for that is when you're younger, you are still developing those muscles, and a majority of that movement is being carried out by the prime mover, and so you don't have that fine coordination. Over time, as you write more and more, you refine not only the prime mover, but you also engage those synergists more. You get that finer movement. Your handwriting gets smaller. You're able to close letters, and you just have better penmanship over time. And that's why those muscles have to be trained and developed, just like every other muscle in your body. Now, the antagonist, that goes back to what I referred to earlier in that your muscles are only able to pull. The fact that your muscles are only able to pull, when you flex your bicep and you pull your arm in, the bicep is done in your muscle movement. If I want to get my arm out of this position, my bicep is not doing anything. I now have to rely on a muscle that will pull in the opposite direction to get my arm to come back out. And so that's what we talk about the antagonist. It is going to be a muscle that works against another muscle. So one muscle will pull in one direction and then its antagonist will pull in the opposite direction so that you guys can get out of a particular movement. With the leg, your hamstring and your quad would be antagonistic partners. So you go to kick a ball, hamstring is going to pull your leg back and get you into the kicking position. And then when you unload that, it's going to be the quad that is going to pull your leg back out. And those two will work in opposite directions. But the antagonistic partners, they work in the opposite direction because your muscles only work in a pulling action. So those were the major ones that I wanted to hit today with this first discussion. We will go back and pick up any slides that we didn't talk about through this lecture the next time that we meet face to face. So we'll go through that muscle contraction, and then we will talk about what fast twitch and slow twitch muscles are as well. I know that slide is blank. There's a reason for that, and we'll get to that in class next time we see each other. So any of the notes that you have through the videos, go ahead and bring those with you to class. Your assignment between now and the next time that we meet face to face is you need to study your bone sheets. You have all of your bone sheets now. And then you did just get that last set, and I posted on Tuesday the ones that you needed to fill in. You are not filling in everything on those last set of sheets that you picked up. So take a look at announcements in Blackboard so that you know exactly which ones you are responsible for on the final. Once you get that last set of sheets filled out, you now have all the bones that you are going to need for the final exam. And make sure that you guys are practicing that. We're going to continue to do activities in class. And those sheets that I've been letting you use and pull out, those are going to start going away, and you are going to have to do stuff just based off of what you have worked on and memorized and know by heart. So please make sure that you are spending time getting ready for that final exam. So take your notes, bring those with you to the next class, and then study your bone sheets and get the bone sheets filled out, that last set of 6, and be ready to go with reviews the next time that we meet face to face.